Okay, we're going to change it up here now on Liquid Lunch. It's me, Hugh. Jen is here, and we're welcoming Kevin Annett back on the show. Kevin, great to see you again.
Good to be here, as always.
I know you're, I just said before we came on, I said you're based in Vancouver, but you're all over the place all the time. And didn't you get, what happened, not let into Britain or kicked out of Britain or something? What happened
that was
there?
years ago. It was interesting. It's about the same time I was on the show.
Yeah.
We were doing, with the invitation of the Mohawk elders in Brantford, we were doing an excavation at the oldest Indian residential school in Canada. That same time, I'm going to England to look up records about the school, and suddenly I can't get into the country. I'm put in an immigration prison, fingerprinted, and deported. So I don't think that was an accident.
Do you think it was a cause and effect situation there, just a little bit?
Well, there was more to it than that, but yes, that was a factor.
Well, I'm not sure if you even know this, but the last time you were here, and we had film that you brought of the bones that you found in Brantford at that residential school, and APTN actually stole our footage and showed it on their newscast or whatever.
Without your knowledge.
Yeah. Without our knowledge.
Yeah. Did they credit you?
I think they did credit us, but they didn't pay us.
It's interesting, Hugh, you say that because APTN, like all the corporate media in Canada, they ignored, like they did with a lot of our evidence, ignored it all until people started attacking us, and then they get that full exposure. So it's biased, to say the least, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, so here we are. Now, I get your emails, Kevin, and there was the one I saw either this week or last week about the ninth circle. There was supposed to be a human sacrifice, baby eating event.
Things get exaggerated on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of talk about that kind of stuff. Actually, do you want to just kind of tell us what that story was? Because it came out of
In a nutshell, there have been reports for a number of years, and ever since 2010 I've been working in Europe with a lot of survivors of not just sexual assault, but all sorts of crimes within mostly the Catholic Church. And I talked to two women who claimed to be part of an intergenerational satanic cult called the Ninth Circle. Yeah. And they described seeing fairly prominent people at it, including quite often Catholic bishops, archbishops, even Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger, former Pope Benedict. And
Pope Emeritus, is he calling himself?
Well, what's interesting, he stepped down directly because of a court case we're involved in.
That's what I was...
And, 4 other cardinals stepped down as a result after being indicted by this court. But these two women, Tos Nienhaus and Anne-Marie van Bienberg, both describe sacrificial events and, related to this Ninth Circle. Now, sources in the Vatican and in Switzerland said a similar ceremony was to go on at summer solstice in Geneva at Notre Dame Cathedral. It's the largest Catholic cathedral there. Right at the same time, Jorge Bergoglio, a.k.a. Pope Francis, is supposed to be there. And apparently there was an attempt to enforce a common law arrest warrant against him. We're getting different scattered reports about that. I don't have a clear picture yet.
Well, I thought you were behind those things.
No. I was part of the original group that started it, but there was... You see, it's part of the misinformation campaign that this is all coming out of Kevin Annett's brain somehow, right? All that hard evidence, all the eyewitnesses, somehow I've fabricated all that, right?
It's your opinion that these are facts.
It's all opinion, and it's a typical, it's not just misinformation, it's the way that we all respond to horrible news.
Yeah.
Horrible evidence. You just deny it. It's a knee-jerk reaction. I understand that. I did it first when I learned these things. But when you put eyewitness testimonies together with documentation, which is a lot of my work in murderbydecree.com, you can see that. The Canadian government had to admit, and they did. I remember in the New York Times in 2015, there was an article, Canada admits cultural genocide, and they always put that adjective in there to kind of soften the blow about genocide. But thousands of children died. They finally admit that after 15 years of campaigning. Right?
And people don't realize that the quotes aren't around the word genocide.
Right. Good point. Yes. So it's true, but truth takes a while to come out, and there's a lot of fog that the guilty put around it so that people can't see the connections and the whole story.
So, I mean... Okay, so we're talking about satanic circles, we're talking about child sacrifice or whatever, and I think since the last time you were here, which, as you said, was a couple years ago, I mean, all this, I mean, there's more and more information like that coming out all the time. The last time you were here, I really never heard of this stuff, and now
That surprises me, actually, because it seems like exactly the kind of thing that you would know all about.
Well, okay. Anyways, but now in the presidential campaign, you had the whole Pizzagate thing, and you're just hearing more and more stories. And I've seen some testimonies of people that look very authentic, like people, like, young women whose their accounts of being involved in satanic cult activity is pretty authentic looking to me. And then we all those the story. Who's that guy? The Jimmy Savile, all that stuff. And then you hear about the Belgians and the I don't know, the Dutch, all kinds of stuff going on.
People,
Don't forget, like if you're somebody caught in this, the first thing you want to do is do what the lawyers say: is you create a paper trail, you create confusion, you talk about a lot of stuff, so they can never see exactly who's doing what. And that's what I find with a lot of these reports. Now, if you look at hard evidence, like let's look at a standing policy in the Roman Catholic Church. It's called Crimen Solicitanus. It's since 1929. It's been the policy governing child abuse in the Catholic Church, and it says in black and white that when children are harmed, the police are not to be told. Everyone is to be put under silence. Papal. This is coming right from the papal office, the Pope. It's like in the confession booth. You're not allowed to talk about it. Same thing. You're not allowed to talk about the crime, and if you do, you're excommunicated. So that's a criminal conspiracy that every Catholic in the world and every clergy is supposed to be involved in. Now that is saying to any child rapist, become a Catholic priest, you'll be protected. That's why there's so much of it. It's a system in place. It isn't about bad apples. It's about, it breeds that system, that kind of environment. Right?
Yeah, it's your zone where you actually have diplomatic immunity to do what you want.
Exactly, and we found
Unbelievable.
in the campaign, this 20-year campaign that I helped initiate about the residential schools, the same thing went on. At first, flat denial. Then, okay, yeah, these things happened, but it wasn't our fault. We didn't plan to do it. And then finally, okay, we did it, but we indemnified ourselves. The government and the churches sat down before the so-called bogus Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they indemnified themselves legally so nobody would go to jail, even though half of the children never came back. We're talking 50,000 dead children. Nobody's ever gone to trial for it.
So who was the politician who talked about solving the Indian problem? And
Duncan Campbell Scott,
Yeah.
Minister of Indian Affairs in the early 20th century. He's the one, it's amazing what comes out of their mouths.
Yeah.
He said half the children do not survive the system. He said that in 1910. 1949, Neil Currie, Deputy Indian Affairs Minister, said the same thing. So why are half the children dying 40 years apart unless it's intentional, right? Nobody's ever addressed that question in Canada, except our campaign.
Now, intentional in what sense? Intentional from... well, I mean, I guess just plain good old-fashioned neglect would maybe not count as intentional, but...
No, but yeah, of course. The neglect is people see there's children being harmed, so they change the conditions, and the death rate goes down. Over 40 to 50 years, the death rate was constant. And Dr. Peter Bryce, who I've printed all of his stuff in my book, Dr. Peter Bryce was an Indian Affairs doctor who was commissioned to go out west, which is where most of the Indian schools were, 1907, 1909. He said, there's a direct quote, "I believe that conditions are being deliberately created to spread infectious disease." He described how in every school, the sick children who had TB and smallpox and that were put in the same dorm as the healthy. They were locked in there and never treated, and that was a common practice year after year. Now, yes, that shows intent. The other factor is you don't die right away from tuberculosis.
No.
It takes a long time. My
And
mom
it's-
told me that before penicillin, they'd take the child the same day and put them in a TB sanitarium. We've got pictures of sick kids sitting alongside the healthy.
Right.
So it was a common practice. So that's intentional. That under the guise of religion, you're trying to wipe out kids to grab their land. That's as simple. I mean, it happened all over
Yeah.
the world. Why wouldn't it happen here?
And it's always the same thing. It's the cui bono. It's who's actually making money off this, because I think we see that in the States right now. We see
Yeah.
the companies that are losing money because there's not as many people being incarcerated, wanting
Right.
to make more money on incarcerating people. So who can you incarcerate? People coming across the border.
And it's back then and still today, of course, it's all about money. the churches, the Anglican, the United, the Catholic churches that ran all these places, these death camps, they got a certain amount of money for every child. So they wouldn't report the death. They'd keep getting the money. I've talked to eyewitnesses who said as little kids they liked to be on the garbage detail because that's the only time they could eat. They'd be shoving the garbage in their mouth because they'd be starved otherwise. The nuns and the priests and the ministers would be preaching about Jesus on Sunday and starving children on Monday, and raping them and sterilizing them and in hospitals. All of the crimes, it's been documented to be genocide, and yet it's a crime without criminals. It's Canadians just saying, well, we've absolved ourselves. So
do you think a problem is the way that Canadians view themselves as being kind of better than other countries? Is that actually standing in our way of admitting these things?
Yeah, and it's a weird attitude to have because it's like we're not aware of our own history.
Yeah.
Talking in America, it's kind of funny because, Americans will say, oh, we're not the only ones who wiped out our Indians, eh?
Yeah.
But in America, people are more willing to own things than Canadians, I find. Almost proudly, right? Kind of the redneck factor, whatever you want to call it. But
we still hate the blacks.
Right, we're not ashamed of the fact that we're racist, okay? But in Canada, it's this huge, enormous system of denial where we can't go against the view that we've been raised with, and I was raised with it too in the United Church, that we send care packages to Haiti, we talk about the love of Jesus, but at the same time, 20% of my offering as a kid in the plate on Sunday was going into the Mission and Service Fund that funded these residential schools where the children were being killed en masse, and it was an open season. If you wanted a kid, you could just go get one, no questions asked. And that went on right to the very end, and the only reason the United Church ever addressed it is because they were sued for it. Then they began to come up with all these justifications in that. But.
Well, one of my first memories of the church, I think I was telling you before we started that my grandfather was a United Church minister. He'd actually come from Church of Scotland, which seemed like hard-ass religion, and then came to the United Church, which was the softer touch. But one of the first memories I have is the Nestle protest against Nestle formula that was going to women in Africa, telling them not to use their own breast milk to feed their babies, but to use their potentially contaminated water sources to make this formula. And I remember that really clearly, but I don't remember anything that we did that was local.
Well, that's ironic. I remember when I was in seminary training for the ministry, I went on a fact-finding tour to Guatemala. The refugee camps, and we were, working with the survivors of the genocide in Guatemala. Now, on the one hand, the United Church is protesting that genocide, and here at home, they're doing the same thing to the Indians, but nobody knows about it because to a person in the church, like any church, your congregation is it. You don't know what you're part of. You don't know about your history or your corporate ties. I mean, the Anglican Church, major investor in landmines. Okay. The Vatican is the largest, 100% owns Beretta Limited, the largest small arms company in the world. It goes on and on.
Man, and people criticize the teachers' union for having had stock in the Maple Leafs.
Oh, they've got nothing. They've got nothing on the Vatican or the big churches because there's this whole centuries-old collusion between empire and church, and they're really big money-sucking organizations and very tied into the whole corporate system. And you don't realize that when you're sitting in the pews, and you just think, you believe what you see and hear, and you don't know what you're part of.
Yeah.
Well, people talk about, I'm not sure where we're going here, Kevin. We're going to go all over the place, maybe.
That's all right.
But, people talk about the Vatican, essentially, and the Roman Empire that never went away.
Right.
And you've mentioned here on the show before that we think Britain broke away with Henry VIII, but then they came back, or they got him back somehow, right? And you're saying, and I don't know if I know this from you is that even if you're paying, that the United Church of Canada sends money to the Vatican.
Well, it's funny. I was invited. Yes, that's true. Not just the United Church, but. Over 120 governments in the world have what's called a financial concordat with the Vatican Bank. And
that includes Canada, right?
As far as I know, although these are secret treaties, so you'd have to ask a member of Parliament who probably doesn't even know.
Right.
But a certain percentage of tax money is sent to the Vatican Bank under these concordats, financial concordats. There's a good site, concordatwatch.eu. They have this documented. It goes way back, but it's the old thing about there's almost two realities. There's the corporate reality that's governing everybody, and then your own experience.
Right.
And we can be blind to very much what the crime we're engaged in.
So I like that with John Moore on CFRB. He always talks about how people are so much more willing to accept their personal experiences than they are to actually look at the facts. And that especially if the facts, well, I knew somebody who was robbed, so that means that crime is on the rise.
Yeah. Exactly. When you can experience something yourself, and that's the difficulty of a lot of, quote, white Canadians relating to the thing of genocide in their own country, because it's so outside their experience, they have nothing to hang it on.
Yeah.
And I know that, and that's what an interesting example of that. For years in this campaign, we were talking about just the truth. Native children were killed.
Yeah.
After a while, we just started started saying children were killed, and that changed it all for people. It suddenly it was like a child. I mean,
you mean like my children,
my kids?
Yeah.
What would happen
if
your child was starved to death and then thrown in a hole somewhere? And wouldn't you want them returned? You think an apology would be enough for you?
Yeah.
Right.
I'm just wondering if maybe the what we're calling intentional genocide is not the same kind of dynamic at play. That that those residential schools administered by the churches were just, if it was white kids, of course they wouldn't have done that. But they were white people looking after Native kids,
and so
it just was. It didn't have the same impact.
Personally, that's true. I'll give you an example of that in my book. Again, murderbydecree.com. You can see all the evidence online. There's a letter from a Dr. Pitts in 1934 about him being criticized. He went around all the BC residential schools, and they criticized for not looking at the fact that so many children were dying. And he said, classic quote, "If I were to apply the same standard of care to Indian children as they do to whites, we'd have to close the schools. But since we can't do that, I shouldn't be criticized." Right. So an acceptable death rate is a third to half. That's an acceptable death rate, because in any system of genocide, there's two standards of care, two standards of law, two standards of humanity. Right. So you can literally look at those children dying and say, well, they're just Indians. They die earlier, and maybe we were racist, so we allowed it. There's all these rationalizations that kick in. But murder is murder, and there's no statute of limitation on a murder, right?
No, and this is very much in keeping with the idea that that as long as you can make sure that something is not costing you money, I mean, because what you're talking about is it's cheaper to let the children die than it is to leave them with their parents, where they might actually cost us money in the long run.
Absolutely, and we found letters from Catholic priests saying we need to send the children who are sick back into the villages, because then we'll solve the Indian problem. That's intent. That's saying take the kids who are sick, and it was a common policy.
Right.
They've got smallpox, send them back into the villages. There was a Reverend John Sheepshanks, and there's been a book written about it. He was commissioned by the Anglican Church to go out among the Chilcotin Indians with smallpox vaccines. One summer, 90% of them died. And he just happened to be a shareholder in the Puget Sound Land Company, co-owned by the Anglican Church and the Hudson's Bay Company, that had preempted the land just before they all died.
Right.
It's all about money, land. In my latest book, The Mouth of a Cannon, and you can get these all on Amazon, I call it the octopus, this triangle of corporation, church, and government. And ironically, that's the issue that got me fired, because I found out that the United Church had been grabbing all this land and then selling it off to their corporate friends like Weyerhaeuser, big logging company, Macmillan Bloedel, for kickbacks. I said, hey, wait a minute. We're not allowed to do that according to our own policy. We have to return it. And I was out on my account within 6 weeks because I was stepping on big money.
Right. Yeah.
And that explains a lot that's happened since then.
Well, it's the way that, for me, the story of the Indonesian tsunami is a story of people who've lived in coastal regions forever, being expelled from their land because they didn't have the right paperwork, and all of a sudden resorts are everywhere that they were. Yeah. Like it's a story of corporate greed displacing people.
Yeah.
And not caring.
Well, that's an old story.
Absolutely, but it's it's not the story that people think of when they think of the tsunami. They think about, oh, it's terrible, a lot of people died, but they don't really look at what the consequences of that were. Just the opportunism that went into seeing a situation, like we've got Native children and their parents sometimes are a wreck and can't take care of them, or their kids are fine, but if we remove them, there's valuable land sitting there.
That was always the rationale, and that's why the missionaries worked so closely with these corporate interests, because under Crown, it's called the Clergy Reserve System. If you were a missionary and you pitched your tent, the Crown, which claimed to own all the land like it still does, that's why we've got to get rid of the Crown, folks, you pitch your tent there and you've got 200 acres around automatically for your church, regardless of who was there. The first thing the missionaries did is grab the land and wipe out the people using vaccinations, all sorts of means. Then they started converting the survivors, right? But you leave out the first two steps in the history books.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There was a sailor that wrote a diary going down the Amazon about all the cultures he saw and like hundreds of thousands of people, and it's always been considered to be a hoax diary because or that he was mistaken, because when people went a very short time afterwards, all those people were all gone, wiped out by European diseases, and it's only been in the last like couple of decades that we know that was actually accurate, and that was unintentional. I mean, I'm sure they would have done things intentionally eventually if they hadn't done it accidentally.
Well, the whole thing about tent is interesting because that applies in a normal court of law, like you were suing me or whatever. Mm-hmm. You need an act and intent. But in cases of group crime, and this was established really clearly at Nuremberg and the Nuremberg legal precedents at the UN in the 1950s that followed, if you're involved in a group crime, you don't have to prove intent at all because there's an inherent assumed intent about a whole culture trying to wipe out another one. Like, you don't have to prove that every SS guard at Auschwitz was trying to kill Jews. They were part of a group crime, a machine whose purpose was to kill off a perceived enemy. That applies to Canada as well. Right. There was the whole idea of terra nullius, there are no people here. We have a right as superior as Christians who have superior ethics to take this land.
These people are doing it wrong anyway.
Right. So the group crime means you don't have to show intent. We are complicit in this, which is why it was all whitewashed, because no perpetrator was ever going to admit they did something wrong.
Is there anything in Canadian law that kind of matches that? I think depraved indifference is an American classification of crime, but that seems to apply here too, that you do things and they're likely to lead to people dying, but you don't care.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's inherent in the whole thing of genocide, because it's based on a simple idea that people who are not like us don't have the right to live, and it's legal and moral for us. Not just legal, but it's a moral act to wipe them out.
Yeah.
It goes way back, actually, to the Crusades, where the papacy brought a thing in called the indulgence, and it said if you kill on behalf of the church, whether it's Jews, pagans, Muslims, Saracens, they called them back then, you are returned to a state of spiritual grace. You have your sins wiped out. So it's good for you to kill the
You mean the same thing that the Americans hate about the Muslims now? That there's a reward in heaven for doing things that they blow out of proportion? And
Islam, political Islam, and political Christianity are very similar. They're universal religions. They say everybody's got to be converted or they die. It's really that. As a matter of fact, in practice, Islam was a bit more lenient because they allowed Jews and Christians to keep their religion. But that's political. We're not talking about people's faith.
No.
Right? In Christ, or as a matter of fact, all you have to do is read the Bible, and you'd say, like, why would Jesus go to church, right? I mean,
that's true.
There's no need, right, folks? But no, I'm talking these empires that arise on the basis of religion, which are lethal because they have this ultimate sanction behind all their crimes, which is God.
And the rewards aren't even in this life, so we don't have to pay you. We don't have to do anything for you. You're still going to do all these things for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so Kevin, what's really going on? Now, there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about. Weren't you involved in setting up common law courts?
Still are.
And this is an important distinction because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that our court system that, you know, when we go down to Old City Hall or whatever, that's
big
an
adversarial
admiralty
machine.
law.
Right, very important.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thank you. It's important to this because we're not just talking about the problem. You're saying, how do people who are caught in this really criminal system, how do you get justice when in a Crown system of admiralty law, the Crown, the perpetrator in this case, can never be found guilty? And we tried on 3 occasions. I was working with lawyers and this went to the Supreme Court in BC, in Ontario, and I believe Nova Scotia. Every time the Supreme Court said the Crown and the churches working under their authority, it's ultra vires, it's beyond our jurisdictional competence.
So they're untouchable.
That's right, because under your own system, you can't be tried. The Queen can't be tried under Crown law, but she can be tried under international law as any flesh and blood person
Right.
can, just like the Pope can. That's why he stepped down in 2013. He knew he was guilty. So what you need is to go back to the foundation of law, which is that governments are not sovereign. You and I are. And we can withdraw our sovereignty at any point if we don't consent. Now, that's not what people think when they mark the ballot. They say, okay, now we're going to do what we're told. Or the police tell us what to do and we're going to obey. No, we can withdraw. It's like Rousseau says in the social contract. We enter in a contract. Contracts can be made null and void if we withdraw our consent. And so that's the idea of a court. When the courts, and it says this in international law, when courts are implicated in a crime, just like governments, the people have an obligation to do their own inquiries, even convene their own courts. And in America, you've had remnants of this survive in the county sheriff system.
Right.
People elect the sheriffs. You know what a sheriff can do? They can arrest corrupt judges. They can convene courts. They are outside. They're like a fourth arm of government. And
elected by the people.
That's an
Elected by
interesting
the
power
states.
that I didn't realize, because I see
Yeah.
I see the flip side of that, where if you've got a corrupt sheriff, you're fucked.
But that's up to the people to make sure that doesn't
Right.
happen, because we are responsible, and that's the thing.
Right.
Self-governance means I don't delegate anything to anyone. I do it myself. That's not anarchy. That's what, according to the ancient Greeks, that's the epitome of democracy, when you take in personal responsibility. We had to do that in Europe. We tried to get the case of genocide into courts here, just shut out. You exhaust your domestic legal remedies, you go to international courts. But none of the international courts were able to put a system on trial. They only put individuals on trial for genocide. So that's why originally it was in 2012, the first case was convened. We took all my evidence, a lot of the evidence from here, plus a lot of testimonies and that from other countries, put it before a common law court that was convened in Brussels. It took 6 months. Convened like in a normal court, subpoenaed all these people. I call them the Dirty 30, the defendants. They were Pope Benedict, Queen Elizabeth Windsor, Stephen Harper, all the people who had fiduciary responsibility. None of them responded, of course, which under law is an admission of guilt.
Right.
You're not contesting what's being said about you. Often judges can then rule automatically in the case of the plaintiff if they're not responding. They were found guilty, and under international law, that means any court in the world can then issue an arrest warrant. Well, that's why Ratzinger stepped down. That's why an enormous spin, the guy who came after, this Mr. Spin Doctor, Smiley Pope Francis, who's got his own skeletons in the closet from Argentina, where he was part of the military junta there, and engaged in trafficking children, an old Vatican practice in a dictatorial regime. Grabbed the children of political prisoners. That's how he made one of his spurs in the church. But these people are all liable as flesh and blood men, and they know it. That's why they're relying on people's incredulity and the law as it stands now to protect them.
Now but here we are. Okay, so it's like if they, meaning the powers that be with their courts and those judges down at Old City Hall, if they subpoena us, and we don't respond, we're actually going to get in trouble. But these common law courts that good people are trying to convene and enforce law, common law, they can ignore the subpoenas, and it just goes. To me, it's an example of it's like whoever's got the guns wins.
Well, that's the Hugh Grotius. He was one of the founders of international law of the maritime law, and that he said the law without cannon fire behind it is an empty vessel. You need force, but we're not talking about violence and physical force. We're talking about moral force. Like, you don't make the Pope resign, and we know he resigned because of the work we're doing, because the Spanish government had been looking at the material in our docket. February the 6th, 2013, a diplomatic note is sent to the Secretary of State Tarcisio Bertoni in the Vatican, and he also stepped down, by the way. And it said, if the Pope comes to Spain, he may be liable to arrest because of what we've seen here, because he's signing letters ordering bishops to cover up not just child abuse, but trafficking, organized trafficking of children within the Catholic Church. 5 days later, Benedict resigns for health reasons, right? And
that never happened before, right?
Not in peacetime, ever. Not in peacetime. There had never been a papal resignation like that. Just like they bring in Francis right after him. Shortest election in Vatican history.
Right.
1 day and he's in. The cardinals didn't even vote, apparently. There weren't even a majority there. He was appointed, first Jesuit. And Jesuits are adept in spin doctrine. That's what they've been done for years, centuries. The whole idea is put a happy face on the Vatican, and people will forget all this, because unfortunately we're conditioned from a young age to want to believe that authority figures are good. We can't believe that somebody in authority would actually plan and go out and kill somebody, right?
Am I right in thinking that the Jesuits control what's left of the Inquisition? That I can't remember what the department is called.
The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith.
Yeah.
And Ratzinger used to head it. The Jesuits are more the financial and the political brains behind the Vatican. They run what's called the Holy Alliance, which is the Espionage and Assassination Bureau for the Vatican. They killed Pope John. Remember John Paul I?
I believe that was an assassination.
He was poisoned after 30 days because he was poking around in the Vatican bank, right? And he found the connections with a lot of nasty people. And no, he didn't last long. But people find this unusual. But if you look, just read history.
Yeah.
This is not unusual if you read history, right? It's the most murderous organization in the history of the planet. Just do a body count. So I mean, it's not surprising at all that this would go on.
But it's all this this idea that we need something for our day-to-day life. We need the spiritual component for our day-to-day life. So we're willing to ignore anything that happens beyond us.
I know.
And it's what causes that the distinction between my children and your children too,
right.
Because you don't think of you've got to take care of your children, so you put your children first.
Right.
So if those children die, then your children actually are better off.
Well, it comes back to the issue we talked about before, which was self-governance. We're not just talking political and legal self-governance, personal and spiritual. We don't need a church. Didn't somebody say the kingdom of heaven is within you?
I think it's desperately important to not join an organization that tells you that the only reason that you're good is because there's consequences beyond you
right.
after death.
Yeah, the fear mechanism there.
Because if I'm not good because it matters now, I'm not good.
So, I mean, what's really going on here? I mean, I don't know, Kevin, if you retain your Christian faith. But, I mean, they say that, what's the real game that's going on here? And, I mean, if you listen to some people, they'll say that it's really not a battle against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Very much. At first I would work in, it's funny because as a clergyman or clergywoman, it doesn't help really on a day-to-day basis to have too much faith. It kind of gets in the way of church business, frankly. And so a lot of the clergy I knew were kind of practical atheists, right? I'd never had to look at my faith until my life got taken apart. I lost my job, my family because of this, blacklisted, the whole bit. And I had to really ask myself that question, what did I believe? Now, it wasn't what I was raised with. My sense of something in me that couldn't be destroyed got stronger. The more I got hit, the stronger it got. And I, in a way, discovered that faith in, I think you could say Christ, but it's really that divine light within all of us that ironically needs a lot of adversity and struggle sometimes to come out. And I found that. I think that churches are not the place to try to practice the teachings of Christ. And I don't mean that cynically, I mean in a very practical way. Because it's like that divine message to us is always saying, you have to make a choice. Christ said God or mammon. The spirit of the world, that corruption and greed and conflict and all the things that we're always
rich men and
against.
camels and needles.
Right.
Yep.
Or what we know is true, and that's the basis of common law. Men and women know what's true. They can sit in a jury, they can judge for themselves. They don't need a judge or a lawyer or a politician or a pope to tell them what to think or believe. Once you know that on a personal level, you have tremendous power. It's kind of like that belief that in quantum physics that within any particle of the universe is its totality, all of the power. You access it within yourself. And I found people say, like, why are you still alive after 25 years? It's because you stand in that light and you have that power behind you. And so I don't know if that's really answered your question, but I've discovered in that darkness, right, that there is something that cannot be put out in us, right?
So what's going to happen? Now, this is like a real big question, but it's like, because it's
we didn't ask the psychic this question. Damn it.
I know. But we should have Kevin on first. Okay, but so either the good people of the world will rise and somehow overturn the corruption, the greed, the wickedness.
Or is it all cyclical?
Or
We're just going to have to keep going through different iterations.
Well, no, or what I was going to say is that things are just going to hit tribulation levels, and then Jesus is going to come back. What do you think, Kevin?
I think the idea of being saved by anything or anyone is a cop-out. It's not reality. Like, you can be spiritual but very realistic at the same time, right? And the way I see, like I often would say to people in counseling, and still do, your experience doesn't lie. You go on what you know from your experience. Not a fanciful idea somewhere, but what you know from your own life experience. And I see all over, because I travel a lot, and I see all over an amazing awakening happening, right? And it's kind of, things are getting really worse and really better all at the same time.
Right.
There's a sifting and a separation. If you want to call that, like in the Bible,
sheeps
sheep and goats. And I had a funny guy in my church. He was an usher, and on Sunday he'd say to people,
"Are you
goats or sheep?" It's kind of like.
Then you find out who's actually read the Bible.
Most of them hadn't. Right? But anyway, there is that sifting out happening, but it starts in here.
Right.
Sifting out between the old allegiances and the new, and it's a painful process. But so is birth. Birth is always painful and bloody, but we wouldn't stop it. It's the same spiritually, right? And that, and I have a tremendous hope because of what I've survived and what I see happening all around me.
I like what you were saying too about how people know the truth when they're actually exposed to it. There was the youngest juror on the Bill Cosby trial was 22 years old, had no idea who Cosby was. Was probably the only person on the jury who wasn't affected by the fame factor.
Really?
And they asked him why he'd made the decision he did to convict, and he said that he heard the women and he could tell they were telling the truth, and he heard Cosby admit to things and knew that he was a liar and heard it.
Yeah.
Just knew it from...
That's the power, again, the power of the common law. You say, judges, we're used to thinking that judges are the authority, and they're not. Common law is the jury. The jury even has the right in America...
Jury nullification.
To rewrite the law.
Yeah.
To remove judges, right?
Yeah.
And that's why ultimately, and you keep saying, which is good, I'm glad you keep saying it, what's behind all this, where are we going? Well, in terms of Canada, let's just talk about Canada. We have this whole colonial structure, which in a way is part of the problem. We've got a Governor General who can remove the government at any time, answerable to the Queen, whoever that is, and this fictitious crown authority, right? And it owns all the land.
She's actually a TV show.
Well, probably. I wouldn't be surprised, But it's time we came of age. It's time we became a republic under the common law. And
we're
that
still
means,
a dominion, right? Are we still...
Well, in that bubble, the corporate bubble we are, but when you step outside it, we're not. We're free men and women, and we can create anything we want. And we need a republic in this country. And there's, in fact, a movement that started in Winnipeg. It's now spreading all over. People are coming. It's like the 100th monkey. They're all coming to this idea independently. They say, well, we need to revoke any allegiance. 58% of Canadians wanted that in a decimal poll in 2013. They said, we want a republic. We want no more ties with this anachronism. 58%.
Oh.
So that Republican movement is acting on that mandate, saying, okay, let's start it, but not by changing hats and having a president in now.
Right.
We need local self-governance. The idea is you form an assembly in your neighborhood and you take back power. You keep the taxes in the community. You rebuild from the bottom up.
Yeah, right? That's the way it's got to be. But what I see happening is that, just even in terms of corporate takeovers, okay? Or I used to be involved with a credit union. There used to be hundreds of credit unions in Ontario. Yeah. Now there's a handful. Yeah. And so you went from hundreds of boards of directors responsibly managing financial institutions to way less people involved in that governance process.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that you got less people acting like adults managing their affairs.
There's that inertia in anything, in any phenomenon in nature and in society. Things are run down. And I know, like, I was active in the 60s and the 70s, and there's this tendency to go, oh, yeah, I've seen it all, right? And get cynical and do the jaded thing. But no, we need to reinvent ourselves and allow ourselves to be reinvented all the time, right? And I love to speak in high schools, right? Because the youth nowadays, their bullshit detector is much better, and they learn things a lot quicker than we ever did. There's a downside. I think they're getting too wrapped up in their technology, and I think that's doing something to our brains, right?
Yeah.
But just the contact, we need to reestablish the contact. But they say, let's go. You know, when I'm talking in high schools, come on, let's go, let's change it. Let's find out what these bastards are who are raping children. Let's stop it, right? And that's the energy we need, and we got to trust that youth and get out of the way when they want to move, right? So.
Yeah, when I was in high school, there were as many kind of young conservatives as there were radicals.
I was a young conservative.
Oh my God!
Well, don't forget, a Tory in Canada is different than a conservative in, say, England or in America.
Oh,
you know?
well, back in those days especially.
Yeah.
Those were the Bill Davis days here in Ontario.
Yeah.
But, well, you know what they say, if you're young and you're not a liberal, then you don't have a heart. If you're old and you're not a conservative, then you don't have a head. Well, I'm the opposite.
Oh, good for you.
Mine is always still. It's okay to believe in Ayn Rand until you're about 17 or 18. If you don't grow out of it after that, if you don't stop being a libertarian, there's something seriously wrong with you.
Well, no. When I came to Toronto, I was a courier, and I applied Ayn Rand thinking to my driving.
That's probably a good thing, though. That's probably why you're alive.
Yeah, that's why you're still alive.
Yeah. Yeah, she's good in certain circumstances. But,
yeah.
You got to take from everybody. I mean,
Exactly.
there's truth in everything. And
Yep.
Okay. So, wait, I had another question. Let's talk about Canada for a second then. You brought it back to Canada. Here we have now the first post-national prime minister, who's, I mean, it just seems that there is a movement, and this goes along with our, heading towards tribulation idea, that a global government seems that there's somebody's trying to put a global one world government into place, and that's part of the big game plan.
And one world religion. That's why Bergoglio spoke to the World Council of Churches.
And he's willing to baptize aliens if they ever show up.
Assuming he isn't one himself.
But that really, I mean, what you're saying was that really translates. We need to translate that into one world corporation.
It's a corporatocracy is really what they're talking about. And, it's, as for Justin, well, if he didn't have the name, he wouldn't be in as prime minister, right? Pretty much. For sure. It's to me, that's a reflection of our media culture. Sure.
Now, we can't have new people. You got to have a second Clinton in the States. You got to have a second Trudeau in Canada.
You got to have a reality TV star.
Pretty much.
I mean, he didn't even get to star with a monkey. Like I could deal with the film star thing a little better.
Yeah.
Also, you can ask him, how come his government ratified very dangerous bill that Harper brought in, the Foreign Investment Protection Act. You should look it up. Section 33, I believe, it's a bilateral agreement with China. It allows China to station security forces on Canadian soil to protect their investments.
Really?
Security forces is defined as anyone who bears arms. So the Chinese army, under that, could be stationed in British Columbia at their mines to protect it. What are they going to do next? Shoot native demonstrators? It's Canadian sovereignty. It doesn't exist. This is why we need to establish it, right?
Does that kind of create the same thing that we've got in Asia, where there's those pockets of sovereign nations?
They call them free trade zones originally back in the 80s, but now they're corporate. The corporation it's where we've evolved towards. There's no governments anymore. These are corporate bodies. A lot of the so-called government agencies are actual privately run. Like best example is the Child and Family Services here in Ontario, private company that gets $30,000 or more for every child they take out of a home and put in a foster family. So for private prisons, it's like the profit motive. You've got massive child trafficking happening all over.
And people complain about social services giving money to actual families.
Why does a mom on welfare get half of what a foster parent gets?
Right.
Well, what are they trying to do there? Destroy a single mom with her?
Yeah.
Apparently.
I think it's part of the plan. To me, that is consistent with a strategy to get us towards a world government. Because
Right.
what you want to do is you want to destabilize heterogeneous communities who decide to take their society in the direction they want.
Bingo.
And the smallest unit of that is the family. So
What genocide is, you destroy the mother-child bond, right? And we saw it happening right here with our own money, with our own laws in the residential schools. It's like we're all on the reservation now. It's happening to all of us. And I say to people, if you've allowed it to happen to native kids, guess who's going to be next? Our own. And it's happening.
It is happening.
can you tell me just how does CBC fit into either stopping or improving the discourse? I've been listening to the Finding Cleo podcast, the same woman who did Connie Walker, who did Missing and Murdered. And honestly, that's been my biggest education about the residential school system.
Okay, let me. I think local CBC people are great. They often covered our stuff, and then it got to a certain level, and bang,
Corporate.
Fifth Estate tried to interview me twice. They got it in the can, and then it was never broadcast. So a lot of political interference. We know that at the higher level. But in terms of the murdered and missing women thing, it's murdered and missing families. The reality is,
that's what our second season is.
Yeah, 2003, we started the community task force into missing people in the downtown east side of Vancouver. We found that, first of all, Wendy Poole was the first one, a Native woman.
Right.
They're blue bloods. They're descendant of the clan mothers. These are targeted killings to wipe out those with the memory of who owns the land. And so it's about the whole deal about land. And I think the Missing Women Inquiry is pretty much like what the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission is.
Right.
It's a government-run distraction.
Let's pretend we're doing
Yep.
something, and then
Hide
we won't
the
ask the
evidence.
real questions.
Protect the perpetrators, hide the
Right.
evidence, go after the people with the real evidence and shut them down. That's what we found happening at the TRC. It's happening again. And, of course, it's not surprising. It's what you do when you got to keep the money machine going and get these people off
and
their
we
land.
have something significant to hide.
Okay, Kevin, so we got to wrap it up, unfortunately. So let's give people some takeaways, some calls to action, some contact information.
Okay.
What do you want to leave
Thank
people
you.
with?
I'd go to Amazon, put my name in, Kevin Annett. You'll see I've written 8 books in the last 2 years just to kind of sum up a lot of this history.
What have you been doing with your time?
Oh, well, like I say, it beats working, right? I've done common law training manuals and that, but also urge people to see the evidence, judge for yourself. Murderbydecree.com, the tribunal website, itccs.org, International Tribunal of Crimes in Church and State, itccs.org. Write to me. I'm at thecommonland@gmail.com. I spend my time going into communities, helping people organize around this and many other issues. I'm doing a lot of work in Ontario now, actually. There's people wanting to organize around lots of issues like child trafficking and police and court corruption, all this stuff.
And we want to assert our individual sovereignty against the corporate state actors.
And there's a movement, the Republic of Kanata, they call it. Republic of Kanata at gmail.com. They put out a book you can see on it's called The Case for Kanata. And it's got a program and a vision for Kanata. I urge people to get that on Amazon. I can send you copies too if you write to me.
Yes, please.
I just happen to have some.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
We love free books.
Okay. Kevin, this has been a great conversation.
I'll see you again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Always fun.
Don't make it 5 years this time.
I won't.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. Then we got more. You know what I'm saying? Hope you got the time, Jen. We're
Okay.
still here. Okay,
Just
we'll be right back.
Keep me with the coffee.
Thatchannel.com.